Hey all, it's Ryder, and I hope you're understanding someone else's perspective better. I've gotten some requests from our community to discuss positioning, build viability, and other topics that I can't justify placing in a single video, but I have grouped up their likeness to present how each build and player should adapt to every PvP environment. If you have suggestions for the channel, or would like to learn from or teach other players, I recommend joining our Discord, linked in the description below. It's a great avenue for the community to teach one another and to further destroy the gatekeeping mentality that plagues ESO's PvP scene. Up until this point in our series, we've discussed how to create your own build and how to survive, but it's time we discuss how these lessons will vary depending on the PvP setting. If you've enjoyed the series so far, make sure to subscribe to the channel, as it lets me know we're making the PvP community stronger in turn. On your screen, I've attached the sequence of topics, and there are timestamps to help you navigate in case you're curious about a particular section. There's a misconception among many players that a build can only belong to a particular category, that being open world and dueling, for example. And while the definition of a build is different from one person to the next, I can confidently express that some tweaks to an existing setup will promote your build's viability across all the PvP settings. In ESO, we have 4 current PvP environments: Battlegrounds, Cyrodiil, Imperial City, and dueling. There's a lot of differences between all of them, and running a build made for one might not yield desirable results when placed in another. In order to understand what changes are required, however, we should first categorize the various statistics in the game. On your screen, I've listed the categories that I've broken a build into. In a vacuum and on a true middle ground generalist, the importance of each should be weighed equally. But when variables enter the mix, the importance of one statistic versus another changes completely, and especially so within each environment. For this reason, when creating your build, be sure not to simply take the numbers on paper to be the answer, but rather you must understand the context to which your build is placed in, as a dueler build would not fare well in Cyrodiil and vice versa. Finally, on your screen, I've attached my outline for each section to better orient your comprehension with my desired learning outcome. Starting with Battlegrounds, this is an environment where champion points are disabled, and teams fight in either groups of 4 or 8. Moreover, in Battlegrounds, there is a constant flow of aggression from both sides with little time between combats, meaning you can always expect danger at any moment, especially within the 8v8 game modes. Many of the maps have various corners and choke points as well, meaning escapes and traps are easy to execute. On the point of champion points being disabled, however, let's note that this means the time to kill is much lower than in any other environment, as well as losing the sustained by suffering passive greatly diminishes sustain through the aforementioned constant fights. While maps are fairly large, many casual Battlegrounds players seem to tunnel vision on a single target, so getting caught out of position without support could prove fatal. To summarize, the time to kill is a lot shorter than usual. And because there's constant fighting without very important recovery passives from champion points, sustain is crippled. Therefore, the importance of each statistic is as displayed on screen. For this and other charts in this video, take these as weights to modify your build. While you absolutely should express freedom in completely changing your builds from one setting to the next, this video is intended for those who enjoy their build but would like to maximize their effectiveness with a few small tweaks. Back to the main point. Because the time to kill is so short, your build won't need as much damage to secure kills. And because there's a guarantee of other enemies nearby, you'll want to prioritize reducing incoming damage and increasing your healing as well. Moreover, because there are so many corners, speed can be a very useful tool, and because the time to kill is so short, can be more effective than attempting to survive against multiple opponents simultaneously. To end this chart, we look to the sustain section, of which is a massive priority given we're losing out on a lot of sustain from our champion points. To modify each stat, I'll offer suggestions that I think to be simple changes. Because we see a decrease in damage's importance, we can transfer our weapon and spell damage glyphs to the recovery section instead, opting for 2 or 3 recovery glyphs on our jewelry. Another option would be the swap of an enchantment of Absorb Magicka or Stamina dependent on your most reliant resource. An infused cost reduction glyph may be a viable option as well, if you're not stacking high into sustained passives like from Animal Companion's 20% recovery bonus passive. Moreover, we can also change our jewelry traits to Protective or Swift for additions to either our mitigation or speed, whichever is more desirable for you. For monster sets, both Bloodspawn and Nibene are strong alternatives to Batlord, as because the need for damage is lower, both mitigation bonuses are about the same, with Nibene providing heavy resistance to pull sets and Bloodspawn giving more ultimate. Roxa is another great set to use for this needed sustain if your build already has high mitigations. Positioning at Battlegrounds sets up the foundation for Cyrodiil and Imperial City, and I recommend practicing here to get a strong grasp of this skill. In PvP, regardless if you're a melee or ranged player, you want to snap your body to corners of the map as often as possible. For melee builds, closing the gap can be especially difficult if a caster is attacking you without consequence, and because the time to kill is much shorter, their pressure can feel unfair at times. Removing their advantage should be your priority within Battlegrounds, and can be done through tactful positioning. On your screen, I provided a simple map that resembles Moda Ka, the Argonian-themed arena. The green and yellow circles represent you and your team, and the red X's represent enemies. On the map, I've labeled ideal positions A through D, and you may notice each of them are around 1 or 2 corners with the exception of position C. The goal of your movement should be to minimize your time within an exposed zone, or the area that you cannot immediately retreat to cover. With cover, you can immediately remove 100% of incoming direct damage, and this should be your primary concern within Battlegrounds. When selecting targets, aim for those who cannot immediately retreat, so then you can not only secure kills, but you don't waste scarce resources pursuing targets who can easily evade you. In this case, the enemy within the middle of the map is the most exposed and would be my primary target, followed by the target just north of position C. Moreover, when hugging corners, you should mind your position relative to both your team spawn and the enemy team spawn. You should always be aware of your team's location so that you may either retreat to them if you need support, or you can rush to them if they are feeling too much pressure. Oftentimes in Battlegrounds, I see players playing as individuals, dying out of position and not being able to peel for their teammates, resulting in a snowball effect that eventually leads to a spawn camp. Even if you are alone outside your spawn, waiting for your team members will assure you don't go in one at a time and can establish strong positions to hold as seen on your screen. To summarize Battlegrounds, you should adjust your build to have more sustain, speed, and healing all at the expense of damage. Moreover, focus on your positioning above everything else, as your location not only impacts you, but the rest of the team, and will increase your survivability by a lot. Cyrodiil, while being a large map, can be sectioned off into a few types of fights, such as tower fights, keeps, fields, and gates. Regardless, however, all of the principles remain the same. But because you're often outnumbered in Cyrodiil, survivability is the most important goal here. When I first learned to 1vx, I tried securing too many kills and callously tossed my in-cap combo into an enemy, only to die to their group a few seconds later. I also found my build had a lot of damage equivalent to a ganker, but because I wasn't fully committing to that role, my ability to outlast fights wasn't as high as I desired. There's a lot of ways to play in Cyrodiil, but because my channel focuses on generalist builds, the advice provided follows this archetype. On your screen, I've listed the modified weights for each category, but you may notice that all the stats are relatively important, save for speed and sustain, which are crucial to focus on for Cyrodiil builds. Unlike the Battleground modifications, we cannot entirely sacrifice damage, as our potential burst windows are really short when facing multiple attackers. While we can extend these windows by increasing our mitigations and HOTS, the balance between damage and survivability is fickle within these cases, so you should proceed with caution. Per that point, mitigation is only useful to a degree, and this matters less as the number of attackers increases. As mentioned, speed will remove all incoming direct damage through line of sighting and will always provide more value than mitigations. Thus, some divestment from mitigations should instead be rerouted into Swift Jewelry or the Celerity Champion Point passive. Because the fights in Cyrodiil can be taxing, given a higher demand of defensive abilities, accounting for your resource pools is vital, as running out of resources happens much faster in Cyrodiil as compared to Imperial City and Duels, and will certainly lead to your death. To adjust your build, Begin with setting a baseline at a non-trial dummy, such as the Vampire Thrall furnishing item. Start the parse with your ultimate and perform your combo until completion. From here, this will give you your baseline damage per second. After this, look over your build to determine your additional speed bonuses, either through Major and Minor Expedition or other additions like Celerity. If you find your speed to be lacking, swap some of your jewelry to Swift, then perform another parse under the same circumstances. If your damage loss is too high, then stop and revert the process until it's at a comfortable position. Note, however, that massive amounts of damage aren't necessarily required to secure kills, and high damage builds might be overkilling their targets and have more room to play with than middle line builds like a brawler. If you don't know where your build fits, watch the video displayed on your screen to orient yourself. I recommend understanding where you're at to understand where you're going. Back to the topic, sustain should be treated in the same way as speed, and should begin with your jewelry traits and enchantments before other changes. If you're unsure where to land, bring copies of your jewelry, some with Swift and weapon damage, and other with Protected and Sustain, for example. Unlike Battlegrounds, where monster sets can be easily swapped to a more defensive option, you may want to keep Balorg or another high damaging set to make up for the deficit created through the additions of Speed and Sustain. If such a damage deficit doesn't exist, however, Zul's or Roxa are great options as well, though I feel silly for continuing to throw these two together in every video. For the positioning section of Cyrodiil, I'm only going to focus on the fields, as this appears to be the most problematic setting for players, and its lessons can be applied to easier locations such as towers or keeps. On your screen, I've attached an incarnate map I quickly threw together. Here, the fight takes place in a field with some trees and a small hill with boulders, both of which are often grouped together in the actual map. When evading pursuers, you need a goal to reach that is clear. Aimlessly running around will lead to further increased time in exposed locations, meaning more damage taken until you can't keep up. As such, in this case, our player is focused on reaching the hill with rocks. The path taken there should attempt to break line of sight on our attackers as much as possible while maintaining a clear lock onto their end goal. As such, we monkey bar from one tree to another, using them as pivoting points to disallow our attackers from asserting aggression. Speed will allow us to reach the rocks much quicker, and smart positioning will maintain our resources while we attempt to do so. If you're confused as to why we chose the rocks as our location, examine the path taken around the rocks and you may notice that we zigzag around them. Like I said in the Battlegrounds section, we want to surround ourselves with as many corners as possible, and due to the sheer number of tight turns, we're constantly surrounded by such corners. While we're here, instead of needing to take on several attackers simultaneously, we can not only remove their pressure, but also funnel them together for devastating AoE attacks while we turn and burn. Like I said, above all else, survivability is the most important feature of Cyrodiil fights, and by positioning correctly, you'll present yourself more effective opportunities to remove opponents from the fight and eventually win. Try to find a specific point to aim for, and reach that destination as quickly as possible. And this is applicable to other parts of Cyrodiil as well, such as reaching the inside of a tower or in a wall within a keep after a breach. To summarize Cyrodiil, ensure all of your stats are relatively high, but especially speed and sustain. Mitigations are important, but jumping between one line of sight point to another takes priority over taking multiple opponents out in the open field. Imperial City takes place with a lot of buildings in tight corners, allowing for quick turns and evasive maneuvers during the many small team fights that take place here. Imperial City currently acts as the intermission between the large fights of Cyrodiil and the intimate 1v1s found in dueling. While some Zergs may exist, many of the lessons within Imperial City pertain to a typical scenario against a few opponents at a time, or during the inevitable 1v1s you'll find yourself in. Imperial City has many NPC enemies in the way, as well as bosses that grant Telvar, which can be translated into a monetary value. Outside of Arboretum, most of the districts offer ample cover and getaways through the building itself or the exterior obstacles like pillars or rubble. On your screen, you'll notice the statistics change quite a bit when compared to Cyrodiil, even though most players lump these two together in the open world category. Most of the time, you're going to have a lot of ultimate at your disposal. So I recommend Balorg to pump your damage stat high and to open with aggression. Because most fights are small scale or even duels, higher damage takes priority, and I can see arguments that damage is more desirable than this graph displays. In turn, mitigations and healing will result in some other strong additions as well, as because you're not required to kite often, the need for speed is reduced, instead supplying the mitigation and healing statistic with a bigger pool of necessity. To cover speed in more depth, this statistic is still vital, but in a separate form. You may find yourself against too many players who relentlessly chase you. In this case, speed is absolutely king, but because speed is a utility with its primary purpose to reach LOS locations, the numerous corners scattered nearly everywhere in Imperial City lessen the need for this statistic. Sustain, while still important, is less so in Imperial City due to passives that grant resources on kill, such as Assassination's Executioner passive or Templar's Repentance skill, but also because small-scale fights are often shorter than larger ones, or in the very least are less taxing. For 1vXing, still maintain a high priority similar to your Cyrodiil tweaks, but consider swapping a jewelry trait to Protective instead of Infused Recovery. Adjusting your build, I would say to remove Bloodspawn entirely, and simply use Balorg for the reason of very high ultimate generation through constant small enemy kills. If you have a Fighter's Guild ability on your front bar, the generation is even faster, and even without, I find myself entering PvP fights with at least 300 ultimate. But if you'd still like even more, slot Camo Hunter front bar for even faster ultimate generation. Because damage is a priority, I wouldn't recommend many other sets for generalist builds, but niche builds like Gankers should stick to their archetype foundations rather than just opting for Balorg all the time. Mechanical Acuity is tough to run in here, provided many enemies lie between yourself and the door to move on to another district. So if you are using Mechanical Acuity, consider crafting and using Order's Wrath or another critical set instead. While mitigations are listed as a higher priority than damage, there is a place for high aggression within Imperial City, as those who start the fight with higher damage often win before a retaliation can occur. As such, if you're quite experienced with PvP, going back to the graph for a moment, swap the values of damage and mitigation, and instead focus on quickly dispatching your enemies rather than preparing for a brawl. In terms of speed, I wouldn't recommend swapping many jewelry pieces to Swift, but slotting a mobility skill and or the Vampire Stage 4 invisibility passive should be enough to entirely avoid danger. If you run without one or both of these options, your death is unfortunately very much so more likely. Positioning in Imperial City differs from Cyrodiil and Battlegrounds, though there are some overlaps. On your screen, you'll see I made another map I scrapped together to demonstrate my point. In this scenario, there's a road in the middle, a building on the left, and an open exposed field on the right. In Cyrodiil, your objective is to identify a location and reach it as quickly as possible. This part so far is the same, as we want to reach the inside of a building, and we can equate the next part to kiting through boulders. In Imperial City, staircases and other obstructions are our friend, and we want to cling to them as soon as possible and as often as possible. Engaging an enemy out in the open isn't a strong idea, but luring them into a building with lots of obstructions and choke points present these same opportunities to boulders in Cyrodiil. With this in mind, we should dart to corners immediately and use pillars along the way to break line of sight to reach this goal. With the exception of Arboretum, identifying nearby escape passages should be your goal prior to an engagement. If you're playing a ranged build, look for some places of high ground which, although rare, can be devastating if used properly, such as to camp a doorway or near a spawn. There's also many small obstructions in the way, so proper use of jumping can easily throw off attackers from you, and is a vastly underestimated tool by most casual PvPers. To summarize, Imperial City is similar to Cyrodiil in a lot of ways, but because there's lots of corners to cling to, speed is less needed but still crucial to success. Aim for higher mitigations and damage, and try to use Balorg more than other monster sets. Duels are the epitome of pressing your foot on the gas pedal and delivering as much damage as you possibly can. In duels, you are racing against your enemy to out-pressure the other, and kiting is often forbidden, or in the very least heavily looked down upon, but more importantly, futile. These fights are really fast, often resulting in a knockout within 30 seconds or less, but some skilled duelists and builds can go on to what seems like a stalemate. Regardless, because being outnumbered is an impossibility, this greatly shifts the necessary stats. To begin, damage is the #1 key to a fight, and this is your win condition. Damage is a stat in ESO that directly impacts the need for everything else. While more speed can lessen the need for mitigation, damage will always reduce the required mitigations, speed, and resources. To explain, if your damage is exceedingly high, then you don't need more mitigations, for your opponent will be forced to play defensively. The locked setting of a duel disallows heavy degrees of kiting, and your damage will often stamp out those who try to run anyway. Some speed is required for people kiting, but more on that soon. And finally, if you're rarely casting defensives because your damage is so high, then your sustain is much higher as well. Experienced duelists know this, opting to disregard defensive sets and solely focus on just damage. But because this video is to inform a wider audience, I haven't placed damage to be 100% of the weight. Instead, I transferred some of the weight to the mitigations and healing category, as there will be times your opponent will perform a burst, and you must be able to survive against theirs. Speed, as mentioned, is almost not a factor in duels whatsoever. That said, you may find yourself against a bowsork or other ranged builds that prefer to keep you at a distance, and so closing that gap will sometimes be necessary. Having some form of mobility is then important enough to acknowledge, but this statistic isn't apparent enough to warrant specializing into, and in fact can often be entirely sacrificed for increased damage. Sustain is not the crux of a build in duels because of the short encounter time. That said, you may want to run at least one resource recovery glyph to ensure you don't bottom out in extended fights. To adjust your build, every setup will be different, but I recommend infused weapon damage rings and necklaces. Balorg and Kjolnar will be necessary for skilled opponents, with dot builds potentially using any dot-based monster set, such as Zons, Marsalok, or Urals. To put simply, prioritize damage heavily, and if your setup is more defensive to account for open world settings, you may need to make more adjustments, such as swapping to the sharpened trait on your weapon, or using the Shadow Mundus rather than the Thief. If you do perform any gear changes, like the other sections, try to make copies of that item rather than transmuting or reconstructing them. Additionally, adding the files into your setup are a great idea as well, and while the best choice for this is to swap a skill line for Blast Bones, I want my advice to be easily implemented. As such, a weapon swap with a disease glyph is a great idea to apply minor defile. In dueling, standing behind your opponent constantly allows you to put pressure into them without receiving much in return. If you continue to backpedal behind them, this is easily achievable. If your opponent uses shocks, or are waiting for a Dawnbreaker, dodging to one side or another will render these abilities useless. Breaking line of sight is often seen as bad manners in a duel, and I know there will be a handful of comments discussing ethics and all that. Besides that though, positioning in a duel simply comes down to where you are relative to your opponent to add mitigations to yourself. While not necessary, it can give you an edge where you are otherwise lacking. If you're playing a ranged build, using Streak and Speed to kite your opponent is a viable way to avoid damage as well. And if you're a Templar, try to stand within your runes as much as possible. I had a hard time condensing all the information in a timely fashion, so I appreciate your patience. If there's something I missed, add to the discussion either below in the comments or more ideally directly to other players within our community Discord. I'll continue to work hard on producing more content to better the PvP scene, so if you found anything useful here, please make sure you subscribe to the channel and share these videos with people you think that might benefit. As always, thank you so much for watching, I really appreciate it, truly from the bottom of my heart. And remember to try to understand someone else's perspective. Ignorance is cringe, to be honest, and to better yourself, you have to challenge your own beliefs. Take care and have a great rest of your day.